Welcome to Talking with Tatchell. Like many of you, when I woke up this morning, I went to the kitchen to get myself a glass of water. I took it for granted that the water would taste okay and that it wouldn't harm me. But for 1.1 billion people on this planet this morning, they didn't have any access to safe, clean drinking water. Many of them, indeed many hundreds of millions of them, had to trek for miles to get a small bucket of dirty water to provide for their families. This lack of safe, clean drinking water is having devastating impacts around the world. Approximately 2.2 million people are dying every year from dirty, contaminated water. 1.8 million of them children. Indeed, 5,000 children die every day because their families lack access to safe, clean drinking water. Surely, the right to have safe, clean drinking water is a human right. It's an essential of life. Yet for billions of people on this planet, it's just a distant dream. With me to discuss the battle for water, for the provision of water to all the world's people, safe, clean water, is Nick Edmans of WaterAid. Welcome, Nick.
Good morning, Peter.
Hi. I wonder if you could tell me roughly what proportion of the world's people don't have access to safe, clean drinking water?
20% of the world's population don't have access to clean drinking water, and 40% don't have access to a safe place to go to the toilet.
What are the main regions affected?
Sub-Saharan Africa is particularly bad, but there are pockets throughout the world, really. It affects places in Asia. Australia suffers from water shortage, but Latin America, but Sub-Saharan Africa is one of the most badly affected areas.
And what are the consequences in terms of the diseases that result from dirty, contaminated water, the diseases that are killing millions of people?
Well, primarily they're easily cured diarrheal illnesses, really. Things that could be easily addressed by simple medications, and they affect children most. As you said earlier, 5,000 people die every day as a result of these sorts of diseases. There's other things, there's parasitic worms and one kind of thing and another, but diarrhea is the main killer.
So we're talking about dysentery plus other diseases like cholera and typhoid.
Yeah. But simple diarrhea is the most
single biggest killer. Yeah. And in terms of which social groups suffer the most, I mean, obviously the impact of the lack of safe, clean drinking water does impact on different ethnicities and different, women, perhaps children. Can you tell us a little bit about the way in which this impacts?
Well, women are most affected in terms of the amount of time they spend collecting water to provide for their families, and some women will walk several hours every day in order to fetch water, carrying upwards of 20 litres of water, which is an incredible weight if you've ever tried to lift that kind of weight. But the children suffer most in terms of deaths. That's the huge cause of infant mortality. Girl children are particularly affected in terms of education, partly because they are often the first to get drafted in to help with fetching water, but also lack of sanitation facilities in schools mean that girl children are often drop out of school once they reach puberty because there are no adequate toilet facilities. It can be difficult to attract teachers to a school if there's no adequate water or sanitation. So it hits the education sector particularly hard. It hits the children. It hits the girl children. But looking further, it's often the case that the marginalised groups in society are the ones who don't get access to adequate facilities. People with disabilities. Often can't get access, partly because of just the accessibility of the source, or because there are taboos and prejudices that prevent them from using facilities that others use. In some countries, caste rules relating to caste and this sort of thing, and religion will bar certain groups of people from accessing the facilities, forcing them to rely on sort of the lowest grade sources of water, such as pools and ponds.
Can you give us an example of that?
Well, in Nepal, we've got there are quite a few people, particularly from the lowest caste, there will often find themselves excluded from using facilities that are provided for an entire community. And part of WaterAid's work is to work with community groups to break down this sort of thing, to try and sort of break down the barriers to inclusion, and to make sure that all people have easy access to safe water. But it's a big task, and it's something that needs to be approached with quite a lot of thought and care, and with whole community involvement.
Can you give us a sense of the issue of water shortages? You know, what are the regions and numbers of people affected by water shortages as opposed to poor quality water?
Well, it's hard to sort of quantify particular areas, but one of the sort of particular challenges, for example, is where there's competition for a water source, where there's agricultural competition and extraction for agricultural purposes can lead to sort of falling water tables, particularly in dry seasons. If the sort of rainfall patterns are changing and you sort of have a period of drought, you can find that the aquifers, that's the underground sort of reservoirs, naturally occurring underground reservoirs that people rely on through wells and boreholes, those can start to dry up, especially if they're not particularly well managed. And that can mean that people have to rely on ever more sort of far-flung sources of water as their most convenient source dries up. So it's a real challenge, and it affects places all over the world, really. But Africa.
Can you give us some specific examples?
Well, we've done a lot of work in countries like Burkina Faso, in using sort of techniques to try and help the recharging of aquifers, because they've experienced the same sort of water stress. Trying to work with partners and local people to implement sort of very simple technologies to try and ensure that what rainfall there is gets into the ground and gets into the aquifers. The sort of things they've done is they build shallow dams, possibly no more than a sort of foot or so high, which trap water when there is rainfall, and to give it the time to sink into the ground and recharge the aquifer. So I know that Burkina Faso in particular has experienced quite a lot of water stress. There are problems in countries like Nepal, things like the geography, the fact that the area is mountainous can mean that it's very difficult for people in certain communities to access a reliable source of water, convenient sources of water.
Yeah. I mean, can you perhaps also give us a sense about conflicts over water?
Well, conflict, I think this is something that we in WaterAid would like to sort of be quite clear about. The most common kinds of conflict are quite localized. I think there's a popular view of sort of conflicts between countries, trans-border conflicts over water. These are actually less of an issue than localized conflicts, because quite often countries have been able to collaborate or cooperate over protecting a major water source for their countries. But at the local level, you can get communities fighting over access to a particular spring or a particular water source. You can get the general public starting to experience sort of water stress as a result of over-extraction by farmers. So
can you give us some specific examples where it's actually happening? And give us a concrete example.
A particular community. Well, we've seen some particular issues to do with drying up of a lake, major lake that people access in Ghana, where people have again increasingly had to come further and further to reach the borders of this lake to collect water. It's hard to call a series of specific locations to mind.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously thinking, say, for example, in Israel-Palestine, there was an Israeli project to divert the River Jordan to irrigate Israel, which will deprive water from the Palestinian territories. This is quite clearly an exacerbating factor in the conflict between the Palestinian and Israeli people. And indeed, it could well be a focus of increasing tension in the region as more water is diverted and the available water for the Palestinian territories is diminished. So that kind of situation to me strikes me as a good example of how water could indeed be an issue of international conflict and tension in years to come.
I mean, this isn't an area that WaterAid particularly gets involved in. We don't sort of deal with trans-border sort of water supply issues, but most of the stuff that we've worked with has been with communities within single countries, and we haven't really managed a situation where there's been a dispute between countries. The most common situations we've come across have been situations of over-extraction by corporations or by primarily agriculture affecting communities. I don't doubt what you're saying. I mean, this sort of thing goes on, but it's the WWF have more involvement in this sort of
Explain what that is.
The Worldwide Fund for Nature have a lot of interest in this area, and they've put out sort of various reports on this and highlighting areas where this conflict exists, but it's not really a WaterAid issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, just to elaborate, I think I can foresee as world population grows, as climate change affects, you know, the whole global natural infrastructure, that we are likely to see in the future, you know, major conflicts over water access and supply. When you think about rising sea levels, you know, impacting on low-lying regions. When you think about, you know, natural reservoirs being overwhelmed, you know, that will possibly have a knock-on effect and affect the lives of hundreds of millions of people.
Absolutely. I mean, you can see situations that are in coastal regions such as Bangladesh. We've sort of dealt with situations where there's salt water has encroached into the water table, so that previously drinkable water sources become saline. Similar such things have affected communities in India as a result of rising sea levels. There are many and sort of various ways in which water stress starts to appear within different communities.
Can you foresee the possibility, as I said, that, you know, maybe in the future a possible source of major international conflict will be over access to fresh water supplies?
It's possible. As I say, it's not something I personally have a great deal of expertise in. It's not something I could sort of particularly comment on, but clearly there are sort of issues. It's been stated not by WaterAid, but by other organisations have talked about the role that water has played in conflict in Sudan, and some of these sort of issues have been going on for a very long time to do with competition over very scarce water supplies, especially as deserts expand and people are scrabbling for ever smaller amounts of fertile land. But one of the big features I think that we're going to be seeing is the combination of scarce water and urbanisation as well, as more and more people move into the city areas, and these cities turn into mega cities, which are in effect mega slums because they're unplanned development, and there's no water or sanitation infrastructure in these cities, and this is something that's moving at an incredible pace. In sort of major cities all over the world, whether it's cities in like Bangladesh, cities in Kenya, which as people move out of the rural areas where they're experiencing water stress, lack of employment, and they come to the city, but the city has no infrastructure to support them. And this is going to cause a lot of conflict, local, but again, it's likely to be at a very local level. And that, I think, will be almost the bigger issue, the growth of the mega slums and the lack of infrastructure to support them.
What about disputes between water companies and local communities?
Well, one of the phenomena that we encounter more often is private water sellers and people like that who actually tap water and sell water basically through sort of taking sort of wagons into slum areas and selling water that's possibly not safe, but probably if it is safe, has been tapped off a public supply and selling that at incredibly high prices to people in slum situations, and that can lead to a lot of conflict. But it often feeds into organised crime and things like this. And these are the places where the conflict is most intense. It's these local settings, people struggling to meet their needs from very limited supplies of water.
I know that in some countries, developing countries, where there's been a big push for water privatisation,
yes, yeah.
There's been a lot of resistance to that. People fear that water prices are going to be hiked, that the company's in it for profit, whereas for many of us we'd say that water is a basic fundamental human right. Can you tell us a little bit about the experience of privatisation in different countries?
It's been different stories in different countries, but and it's also changed quite a bit in recent years. There have been some unsuccessful attempts to bring the private sector into provision, into water provision.
Whereabouts?
Tanzania. There was a particular a case where there was the private sector involvement, but these are incredibly complex situations, and quite often the private sector companies are overwhelmed by the difficulties they face. And WaterAid in particular, we tend to advocate a strong role both for local government in the water provision and community involvement, because it's naive to think that you can bring in an external, possibly even a foreign corporation, and solve some of these intractable problems. The truth of the matter is that private sector involvement can take many different forms, and it's what form it takes that's absolutely key. I mean, it can take the form of consultancy, but it can take the form of technical advice. But where it starts to come down to sort of ownership of the water sources, that is where it's really not acceptable, and it really needs to be something which remains, the ownership of the actual water sources needs to remain in the hands of governments, local government.
Mm. And talking of government, I mean, quite clearly this is a major international issue. What kind of international action is taking place? What are governmental and intergovernmental bodies doing? How would you assess the level of action or inaction on safe, clean water provision and hygienic sanitation?
There's not enough is being done. We've got the UN's established the Millennium Development Goals to try and halve the people without access to clean water and sanitation by 2015. They're woefully off track in most of the key countries. It's been estimated that $30 billion a year needs to be invested in water infrastructure to meet the Millennium Development Goals. That's 30 billion every year, and in fact only about 14 billion is actually being invested. So but that is peanuts by comparison to global expenditure on weapons and war. Or any of these things.
It's a fraction of global military expenditure.
Absolutely. It would take very little commitment. I mean, you can compare it to any number of different areas, like the turnover of certain key industries or whatever, and it still remains a pitifully small amount of money to put this problem right. It all comes down to political will in the end. There are some of the issues are the lack of transparency in the countries in question, do donors have the confidence to give money if they can't see that it's being well spent? And there's certain areas where the capacity to actually spend the money isn't there. Money is being donated, and countries aren't able to actually spend it because they don't have the resource or the skills to invest it and make the progress that's needed. But typically it's a lack of will at both international level and at local level.
Can you give us an example of a country where effective action is being taken?
A lot of progress has been made in countries like Bangladesh. Has done a lot of made a lot of progress with water supply issues. They face different problems in many ways than many countries. One of their problems is water quality and arsenic contamination in water. you know, a lot of progress has been made in India, but it's patchy. The core issue is the equity side of things. You know, certain communities will be quite well served in many countries, but it'll be these marginalised groups that don't get water, don't get good quality water, whether it's remote rural communities, whether it's slum dwellers. I mean, I'll give a typical example where actually some progress has been made recently in Bangladesh is issues of land tenure being a barrier. Governments don't want to invest in infrastructure to serve squatter communities where their land tenure is illegal. And that creates you know, an apparently insurmountable obstacle to making any progress. Now in Bangladesh, community groups working with some of WaterAid's partners have actually persuaded the Bangladeshi government that it's worth their while to actually put this infrastructure in because you know, possibly not ironically, but the poor people are some of the best payers. You're more likely to pay for the water than other sectors of the community. And in fact, the government in Bangladesh have accepted some of these principles and have overturned previous thinking in terms of not putting water into these sort of illegally occupied areas.
What do you think is stopping the United Nations taking a more proactive and assertive role?
Well, there is a tendency for the international community to think in kind of silos. There'll be education on the one hand, and there'll be health on the other, and these things get put into sort of particular boxes, and then they become large amounts of money will get channeled to one of them without taking an overview and seeing the interlinkages between the different sectors. So water and sanitation may be quite not particularly sexy sector. People would rather invest in, for example, in health or in education. I mean, one of our issues is to make sure that the great work that was done by Hilary Benn in promoting water and sanitation from the point of view of the UK government continues and isn't overturned by the new Prime Minister's interest in education. And that, you know, because we would maintain that if you don't have adequate water and sanitation, the children won't get to school. And that kind of sector-focused way of looking at things can be quite a barrier.
I think we can draw from our own history here in England, in Victorian England. Provision of good sanitation was the single greatest factor in cutting infectious diseases
and child mortality.
Yeah.
And it's so widely recognised. It seems extraordinary that both national governments and international governments aren't prepared to invest enough money. And the actual levels of investment in sanitation and water have been declining over the last 10 years in real terms. And when compared to other sectors where the spend has been increasing dramatically, it doesn't make sense because it underpins so many other areas, you know.
Can you give us a flavour about some of the projects and work that WaterAid is doing in developing countries? Some specific examples, specific countries, specific projects.
Yeah, okay. Well, I've talked a bit earlier on about some of the work we've been doing in Burkina Faso on water resource management, trying to ensure that rainfall is captured and channeled such that it gets back into the groundwater and replenishes aquifers. We've done a lot of work with hygiene education in India and Bangladesh, trying to make sure that children make children aware of the impact that simple processes like hand washing have in terms of transmission of diarrheal diseases, and actually through working with partners educate the children so the children take the messages home and pass them on to their parents, and try and get this message out, because it's surprising how little understood those connections are. Just as there was back in the 19th century, John Snow was the person who discovered that the cholera epidemic in London was being transmitted manually by people touching a hand pump with dirty hands. Well, that learning hasn't actually been transmitted in many communities in the countries in which we work, and so it's getting those sorts of messages out has made a huge difference.
So it's education as much as provision.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Absolutely.
Can you give us a flavour a bit more about provision?
So the sort of techniques that we are focusing on are sort of community-led techniques, and you know, it's very easy for NGOs to go in and build toilets and put water pumps in and walk away and find 2 years later that they're not being used, that toilets are being used as tool sheds, and that water pumps have broken down and nobody's taken the trouble to fix them. And you know, the amazing thing is that you may find that a community who's just simply provided with a pump won't necessarily be aware that the illnesses that they're getting are coming from the sort of septic water source that they're going to. They won't make that connection. So we work at a community level, particularly working with the women in the community, to try and explain the connections between dirty water, lack of hand washing, and the facilities, so that we get buy-in for for the facilities that we're putting in. And we also were quite careful to make sure that the people in the community actually contribute to the building of facilities and
what facilities, for example?
For example, building a well. I mean, there's a lot of work that we've done in Africa where the whole community will get together with the help of a partner, which will again be a local organisation, to teach the community how to build a well, how to dig a well safely, and how to line a well with bricks, how to build toilets, and how to reuse the waste in the toilets to fertilise fields, having sort of used ash to sterilise it. There's all sorts of techniques like that. But what we really, our sort of overall approach is to test and demonstrate these sorts of techniques so that they can be replicated by other organisations, which may be government, it may be other local-based NGOs. And in many ways, what we're trying to do is to test and demonstrate effective technologies and demonstrate techniques for overcoming problems. For example, problems of exclusion. If we demonstrate how, by working with a community, you can bring the community round to understanding you know, the nature of the inequity that's being practiced within their community, we can get people to correct their behaviours. But then those techniques of engaging with the community through partners can then be replicated by other organisations, particularly government.
Yeah. So it's an actual philosophy of empowering local communities and peoples.
Absolutely,
yeah.
And developing what we call capacity through creating local organisations to take the work forward.
Okay. Well, thank you, Nick Edmans, very much.
Thank you, Peter.
And for viewers interested, please support WaterAid's very, very valuable work. You can go to WaterAid at www.wateraid.org. It's a very, very worthwhile charity doing very important, empowering work in developing countries to bring millions of people access to safe, clean drinking water. Join me next week for another edition of Talking with Tatchell.